How do we take this capture and turn it into this using Lightroom and Photoshop? Let's take a look. Most of what I achieved with this edit was done with a technique known as luminosity masking, and it's that technique that I'm going to share with you in this video. This is a commercial architectural photography project that I shot recently. I have 3 exposures. I always like to shoot a bracketed set, and that is so that we have the best information for the shadows, the best information for the highlights, and we can merge all of that together. So the first thing that I like to do is actually select all of the images, right click and come to Photo Merge inside of Lightroom, and I'm going to choose HDR. I shot this on a tripod, so there shouldn't be any alignment issues, but it's not a bad idea just to turn auto align on to make sure that your layers line up. Auto settings is currently on, but I actually like to work with that off because I have my own preset, which is a better starting point than Lightroom's auto settings. In terms of deghosting amount, there may have been a little bit of movement in the clouds, but nothing else should be moving. So really I don't need to have any deghosting turned on. Obviously, if there was someone moving around inside the building, then we would want to at least have that taken care of. And if you want to see where any of that deghosting is going on, you just click Show Deghost Overlay. Currently there are no warnings to show me that there is any movement inside my frame. And so all I need to do now is just click Merge. Lightroom's going to do its thing, crunching that data, and now we have a merged stack which contains our HDR version and the 3 originals. Now we currently do have Lightroom's auto HDR adjustments there. I don't want to start with those, so I'm just going to reset them because I want to actually show you something important. If I click on the base exposure here, you'll notice that nothing really changes in terms of the image. We have a slight movement in the clouds, but in terms of the actual exposure in the brightness and darkness of the photo, everything looks the same. And so if I select both of these and we were to start actually making some changes to this file, for example, you can see that with auto sync on, the photos still look identical. So it's actually a misconception that people think that Lightroom's HDR merge is actually creating and doing all the HDR work for you. The true benefit of the HDR file is that we have a cleaner file with more dynamic range to work with. So now I've zoomed in. If I come even closer so that you can see this on YouTube, I'll go to 400%, and this is our HDR version. If I switch over to the single frame capture, you can see that it's much more noisy in that shadow area, whereas those shadows are rendered much smoother with the HDR version. So it's a much nicer file for us to work with. So that I can work through my workflow quickly, I have an HDR fix for architecture, and once I've applied that, all I need to do is just work with the exposure to make sure that I have a good middle ground exposure. Something like that's pretty good. And we also need to fix the color temperature, which is way off at the moment. But this is going to be a very difficult thing to do because we're working with so many mixed light sources. Currently, we have a purple sky. So what happens if we set that to more of a blue color? You're going to see that the color of the lights in the building gets way off. What if we use our white balance sample point here? Well, if I click on what I know is a neutral gray, or neutral tone, the black of the building here, you can see we've created a weird grey sky and a very toxic yellow interior. And if we click around in other places, let's say we had some white light, so we want to click there, we're back to that purpley look. What about the concrete? We know that the concrete should be kind of grey. Well, that's getting us pretty close, but again, we're still in that purple zone. So what I would recommend you do when you have a mix of colors like this is to go all in color matching for just one of them. So the biggest light source in this case is the sky. And so I'm going to set that more to a blue and just make sure that I'm happy with the actual sky color. Let's get the white balance selector and just click on here again and see how that looks. It's not too bad, it is quite purpley, so I'm just going to reduce the temperature down. The sky looks pretty good there, we're a little bit green, so I'm just going to push that tint up slightly. And I'm going to say I'm happy with the exterior, however the lighting going on inside is way off, and that's where we can come into our color channels here, just open up the color, and we can talk directly into the greens and the yellows to get this in a better place. So currently we have a lot of green light, which should be more towards a warm yellow or orange, so I'm just going to push that over in the hue towards the yellows. I'm also going to grab the yellow slider as well and just have a play with that and just see how that's affecting things. And we currently have quite a bit of cyan, I believe, as well going on. So what we can do is just grab that cyan or aqua slider, they call it in Lightroom, and just have a play with that, see what that's doing. And if we feel like we just want to neutralize that a little bit, we can grab the saturation and bring that down. And now if I press the backslash key so we can see our before and after, that's looking much better already. In terms of working with the detail, I want to make sure that some sharpening is applied, and that is done through that preset. And also the luminance reduction, I might just push a little bit more of that in just to make sure that we're pretty smooth in those shadows. I'm pretty happy with that, it's not too bad. Now in terms of getting some good bang for our buck in terms of corrections, let's jump into the transform tool, and I'm going to grab the guided tool here. Of course we could just click auto and see what that does for us. However, if I zoom in and we look at an edge that we've got going on here, I'm just going to come back out of 400% and go to 100 so we see a little more. And I move that over to the edge of Lightroom's viewing area here. You can see that it hasn't made it perfectly true and straight. And so we're going to get a much better result if we actually use the guided tool. So I'm going to turn that off. We're going to go back to where we were. Now I'm clicking guided, and that's going to allow me to draw 4 guides over things that I know should be parallel. So I'll pull one across the horizon, and now I'm going to pull down and just correct for the verticals. That's looking pretty good. Let's just zoom in again. We'll go to 100%, and I'm just going to make sure that this line is nice and true, nice and vertical. So I'm going to bring that over, and you can see that I haven't quite nailed it. So I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to make sure that that is following the true vertical. We could do that for each of the guides that we've put on, but for all intents and purposes, I think we're close enough. Now before we go into the lovely accurate luminosity masking, what I'm going to do is just create a virtual copy of this so I can make some quick adjustments to show you what we want to avoid. Because we have a lovely data-rich file now, we're able to actually boost the shadows and drop the highlights and not lose any detail. So you might think, well, why don't I just do this? Why don't I just boost the blacks and shadows, drop the highlights and whites, and then just crank the contrast? And you could say, hey, look, I've got an image where I can see all of the highlights now. I've got all detail in there. I can see all in the shadows. Winning. Why would I need to bother with luminosity masking? And absolutely, you could do this as a very quick fix. But if I toggle the before and the after, you'll see that we've actually lost a lot of that lovely contrast that we initially had in our edit. And it's that contrast that we want to maintain whilst still being able to see all of the highlight and shadow detail. And we do that with luminosity masking. So I'm going to select our correctly edited version. I'm going to right click, come to edit in, and choose open as smart object in Photoshop. So the first thing I like to do is name my bottom layer base, just so I have a reference. From here we're going to create 2 new layers, one to control the highlights, one to control the shadows. And to be honest, the highlights are already looking pretty good in this example. So just to allow us to get a little bit more differential between the highlight and shadow recovery, what I'm going to do is just boost the exposure a little bit higher. Make sure we got a lot of nice contrast in the photo, and I'm going to do that at the expense of those highlights, and that's fine. This is going to be our new base. We're going to work with this. So what we want to do now is create 2 layers, one that is going to bring back information in these highlights and one that is going to bring back information in the shadows. That will give us a flatter and less contrasty image, but we can then reintroduce contrast once we have all of that information available to us. So let me show you how to do that. We right click, come to new smart object via copy. And that's very important, because if you actually just copied this layer just by dragging it down to make new layer, any changes we were to come in and actually make to this version is then going to be mirrored on the layer underneath. So you see we now have 2 identical layers. That's obviously not what we want. So I'm just going to get rid of that, and if I make changes to a new smart object that was created via copy, if I edit the adjustments in Camera Raw, this layer will be affected, but the one underneath, the original one, will not. So this is our layer to control the highlights, and what I like to do is actually drop the exposure down to look after these areas rather than bringing down the highlights and the whites, because if I reset that and I just grab the highlight slider and the white slider, and now we've recovered those highlight details, however it starts to look very flat and washed out very quickly. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z a couple of times just to undo that, and I'm going to come back to the exposure slider. Yes, absolutely, we can drop the highlights a little bit and drop the whites a little bit, but a combination of using the exposure slider predominantly is going to give us a nicer, cleaner result in those highlights. Now this next bit of information is key to the success of your exposure blend. You also want to boost up the blacks and the shadows, because what we're trying to do is actually create a file that matches in the midtones. So I'll just shrink down the Camera Raw dialog box by clicking these little arrows here, and to see the layer that we're working on along with the original. and that's going to allow me to see that the blacks and the shadows are actually brighter in this version than they are in our base layer, and that's really important for our merge. So I'm pretty happy with that. We can see all the highlights. Click OK. I like to stay organized, so we'll make sure that's called highlights. But now currently the whole photo is being affected. I only want to introduce this layer into those highlight areas. And the best way to do that, I find, is with 𝗨𝗲𝗄𝗔, because we can just click the L button that represents highlights and we can just create a mask directly from that. We click that mask button, and now in my layers I have that masked only over the highlights. If you don't have 𝗨𝗲𝗄𝗔 yet, I'm going to show you an alternative method. So I'm just throwing that mask in the bin and I'm going to create a new mask here. One option would be to use our channel. So if I view our channels here, we have the red, green and blue channels, and that's going to allow us to mask those bright highlights nice and easily. However, there is another alternative as well. You can come into image, we're going to choose apply image, and with our blending mode set to multiply, we press OK. And then again, we've created a similar result there as we did previously. But if I hold down the Alt key and click on the mask and we look at the mask, it's nowhere near as refined as the mask that we were able to create with 𝗨𝗲𝗄𝗔. And so that's one of the reasons I much prefer actually using 𝗨𝗲𝗄𝗔, which I'll put a link to it in the description below so you guys can check it out. But it's so much better because we can come in and be more refined. We can get a wider mask. We can get really tight in those highlights if we want, just by selecting the different versions of the lights. We can also come in, select the dark pixels as well. So if you're an architectural or real estate photographer, this is an absolute must-have tool in my opinion, because it's going to give you so much accuracy and speed around creating these masks. And another really useful thing for precisely controlling the mask is that if we decide that, you know what, clicking on the larger light selection is giving us too much, and coming down to L2 is a little bit too tight around the mask, what we can do is grab this slider and bring it up and fine tune that selection. So we can get quite precise, and once we're happy, we just click that mask button there, and now we have our highlight control put into the photo. So let's do the same thing for the shadows. I'm going to right click, come to New Smart Object via Copy. Now double click to open the Camera Raw settings. And now we just want to make sure that the exposure in the shadows is nice and rich so that we can actually see some information in there. And to get a believable blend, we want to make sure that our highlights are kept low as well as the whites as well. I often find that the details in the shadows are easy to get lost, and so one thing that can benefit us is actually grabbing the clarity slider and just giving that a little bump in the shadow layer. So let's click OK. Now I'm going to come up and hide this layer so that we see our original. We're going to be able to use 𝗨𝗲𝗄𝗔 to create a dark pixel mask this time. As you know, in terms of a mask, white reveals, black conceals. So anywhere that we're seeing white in this mask, we're going to see what we just created in Camera Raw. So I'm going to click Mask, which will create a mask over that layer. Currently we can't see anything because I hid it. And now as I click the eyeball to reveal, you can see that we're getting all of that information revealed to us in the darker parts of the building. And that is so important for the architects and designers to see all of that structural detail. So this was our original photo, and this is where we've got to. The original looks lovely and contrasty, however, we're losing information in the highlights and the shadows as well. So that is the purpose of using these two layers, to bring back that information. From here, it'd be pretty easy just to reintroduce contrast with a basic S-curve, just to bring back all of that lovely rich contrast, while at the same time we now have all of the information in the highlights and the shadows preserved. But for now, we're not going to worry about this contrast. I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to show you how we can get more refined with these highlights and shadows layers so that we're not losing all of that lovely information. The key here is to think, where do I want these highlights applied? Because it looks great in the building where the internal lighting is. However, if you look at the sky with the before and after, it's just sort of washing out the sky just a little bit, and we're losing that interest in the cloud in the top left. And so what we can do is create what I call a double mask. So I'm going to create a group here, and I've just dragged the highlights layer into the group. Currently, no difference. It's doing exactly what it was doing before. But the great thing about this is we can now create a secondary mask on top of the group. And if I press Ctrl-I on the keyboard, I invert that mask. So we're now hiding all of the information brought back in that highlight layer. But the great thing is now we can actually grab a brush. I'm going to press D on the keyboard, to set the default black and white colors. X on the keyboard is going to exchange those colors, so I now have access to white, yay, and I'm going to press B to get to my brush. You want to make sure that the mask on the group is selected, and now what I can do is actually paint this effect back in. Normally I would build this up, but I'm going to go straight to 100% so that you can see exactly what this does. So as I drag my brush over, I'm bringing in that highlight information, but only through the building here. Perhaps we'll put a little bit of it onto the tarmac as well. And now let's see before and after. We've controlled those highlights, but we haven't affected the sky. Here's our before, here's our after. All of that detail taken care of. We can do the same thing with the shadows as well. So we've added these shadows, and you can see that it's currently affecting the sky and losing us a little bit of that contrast information just above the building. It's also brightening up the concrete as well, which isn't really what we want. We just want to bring information and shadow detail back into the building itself. And so again, really easy. We're just going to create a new group, drag that layer in, make sure it's visible. If you press Alt and click on the mask at the same time, that will create a black mask for us straight away. And again, we can come in and just paint that effect back in only where we want it. If there's information like this dark chair here that we want to lift up, we can paint over that as well. Super easy, before and after, before and after. Okay, now we've created these two luminosity masks. What I'm going to do is just create a stamped visible layer, and that's going to allow me to do my retouching. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that we actually have sides to our photo. So I'm just going to come in, I'm just going to select a small area here with just a little bit of overlap, and I'm going to press Shift F5 together. That allows me access to the fill dialog box, and here I just make sure that from the content selection I have content aware, click OK, and there you go, Photoshop starts to fill that in for me. I'm not too worried about keeping this window here on this occasion, so I'm just going to come down here and see what it does for me. That's certainly not the best repair we'd ever see, so let's give it another go. Control D deselects that, and I would be able to do a much better job than what I've done there. However, as retouching isn't really the purpose of this video, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just following that process of selecting an area that I want to repair, pressing Shift F5 and then pressing Enter on the keyboard to get content aware fill just to do its thing. And if you're not happy with any of the repairs it does, you can always just rerun that by again pressing Shift 5 and Enter. I find that working in blocks in the way that I'm doing here usually gives better results than trying to do too much at once. And then if it doesn't quite nail it, you can come in and deal to that section on its own. So the bar here, obviously that's disappearing. We need to sort that out, but you know what, I'm just going to fix the sky up nice and quickly and press Control D to deselect that, and I'm going to use the clone tool just to steal from the column to the right here. So I'm just holding Alt and clicking on the edge of that, and that allows me to come over and align with the window strut that we have here and drag up. And I want to make sure that I'm matching this T section with the top component here, and there we go, we can paint that in. And now if we have a look at our before and our after, you'd never know the difference. One recommendation I would certainly make is to make sure you go out with a clean sensor. I've got a few dust spots here, so I'm just going to go through with the heal tool and just click on those and just get rid of them. So now all we need to do is reintroduce contrast. And I showed you before how adding an S-curve can certainly do that for us. But the problem with that is it's a pretty crude approach. Like, yes, this looks way better from this to this, popping that contrast back in, but that isn't my preferred method. Because we're able to leverage Lumenzia, what I would recommend you do is absolutely use it. If I click M here, we can get access to the midtones, and it's the midtones for me that are currently just a little bit overexposed. So by clicking the curves button after I've selected a midtone mask means I now can access only the midtones with the curve. And that allows me to be much more precise with the changes that I'm making. So here's our before, here's our after. Basically any area that you want to isolate. So for example, let's say we wanted to pop in a bit more shadow control. We just press D to select the darks. And again, we can come in and either use a curves, or if you prefer levels, you can work with levels. But obviously curves gives us a lot more control over what we're doing. That's just lifting those shadows back up again. And if we want to be specific about where exactly we're painting that in, we can use that double mask technique again, which I would recommend you create an action for. So for me, I just click my action and straight away I'm able just to paint this effect in where I want it. So if I feel like we just need a little bit more color there, sorry, brightness, not color, or along here, we can absolutely just come in and paint that in where we want it, before and after. Just to bring more emphasis between the building and the sky, I'd like to actually come in and just work with the sky, brighten up this area closer to the horizon, darken down the top. Yeah, of course I could do a linear gradient, but we can be more precise about what we're after here. Clicking lights is one way to get close to selecting the sky. If I go for a light mid-tone mask like this, it's going to allow me a little bit more accuracy to just really punch into that sky. So I'm going to come into the curves that we've created, which actually dropped inside of that group I created, which I don't want, but I'm going to double click this and start lifting up that brightness. I'm going to make sure that we're not bringing up the shadows too much. And again, I'm going to apply a double mask to that effect. So I'll click the play button, and now with a nice big brush, I can just click and paint that effect in closer to the horizon. Probably a little bit too much just here. We're getting a little bit overexposed, so I'll remove that. But here's our before, here's our after, before and after. I've bled over the building just a little bit too much, so I'll remove that. Okay, let's see where we came from. I'm going to select the base layer, right click and create a new smart object via copy. I'm going to drag that up to the top and double click it to access camera raw. And now by holding the Alt key on my keyboard, I'm able just to reset all of the settings. So you can just go through and reset those settings that you want to. In our case, that's all of them. So I'm just going to click those, click OK. And there we have our original merged HDR file. So from this to this, that is quite a transformation. Here's our initial merged HDR file, and here's what we created with the luminosity masking technique and Lumenzia. So here's our before, here's our after, before and after. So I've shown you a way that we can create precise luminosity masks using image and apply image. However, this is not the best way to do it. You certainly, if you're doing this regularly, would benefit from getting hold of Lumenzia. I'll put a link to it in the description below. There's also a great course that the guy who made this has also put together. So certainly check that out. It's really going to help you work with your architectural images so that you can go from things like this to this. After recording this video, I did apply one more step, which I apply to every architectural photo that I edit, and that took our image from this to this. If you'd like me to share that process with you, please just write finishing in the comments below, and if I get enough requests, I'll put a video together on that as well. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.